Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. This is workshop 2 for our afternoon sessions, and we are talking about the energy equity framework and an overview of it. Today, we're going to be getting an overview of specifically the University of Michigan's Energy Equity Project report and the surrounding work, and be talking about how we can use the knowledge of social burdens and equity impact to advance social equity in building electrification or building decarbonization. I'm Robin Lisowski of Slipstream. So happy to be here with you all today, and I've got the pleasure of introducing our main presenter today, who is Justin Schott. Justin serves as the project manager of the Energy Equity Project. Prior to coming to the Energy Equity Project, Schott was executive director of EcoWorks, a Detroit nonprofit, from 2015 to 2020. He is an avid social entrepreneur and a recognized sustainability leader in Detroit. Prior to becoming executive director, Schott designed and managed the launch and operations of numerous community programs, including the Youth Energy Squad, who's the founder of that initiative, which grew from a summer pilot employing 4 students in 2009 to a citywide partnership with Detroit Public Schools Community District. Most recently, Justin is project manager of the Detroit Climate Strategy and architect of Net Zero for All. Starting today, acronym FAST, F-A-S-T, an initiative to eliminate climate pollution in Southeast Michigan while keeping equity and justice front and center. So Justin and I had a chance to chat a little bit earlier today, and I understand that we might have a bonus presenter as well. Is that still the case, Justin?
I hope so. So I'm going to see if my colleague Rahul Agrawal Bejarano, who's our lead data scientist on the project, is available to talk some more data details if people have questions.
Okay, so we will watch for Rahul. We've got until about 2:45 today, Justin, and maybe Rahul will give some presentation. We'll have really ample time for questions and answers from the audience, and then we'll close out our time together and go back into a full group. I think if you can share your slides now, Justin, that would be great, and you can kind of begin your remarks whenever you're ready. Thanks again for sharing them with us.
Super. Thanks, Robin. Well, I just want to say hello to everybody. I'm Justin Schott, he, him, based here on Anishinaabe lands, also known as Ann Arbor, Michigan, and working at the School for Environment and Sustainability here. Since we're a small group, I'd love to hear the equity concerns that you're running into with building decarbonization. So if you want to share those here or put those in the chat just to give us a starting point for the session, that would be really helpful for me. And I'll say, yeah, again, since this is small, feel free to just jump in or interrupt. If you like using the hand raise function, that's cool too. Or chat, whatever's easiest. But I hope we can make this as interactive as possible. So hi, everybody.
Maybe I'll break the seal here. Oh, I see Quinn coming off mute. So let's have Quinn break the seal.
Sure. Thanks very much. My name's Quinn. I'm a policy analyst at a nonprofit called Elevate. One of the equity concerns that I get a lot is bill affordability and affordability in general when it comes to electrification, mostly just because so I'm located in Chicago, and there are a lot of older buildings that in order to electrify would need to upgrade the electrical service, which is super expensive. And then even if you can kind of overcome a lot of the upfront costs, natural gas it's becoming more and more expensive. So it's the steam of this argument is running out, but it can sometimes still be more expensive to electrify even on an operational front. So the cost for the tenants, obviously there's the upfront cost, but then the cost of the tenants and concerns about affordability for folks in the affordable housing space is kind of one of the first things that we run into a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Quinn. I hear that tension all the time around electrification and affordability.
I'll just note that that's being reiterated by Tim in the chat too, that electrification, and a focus on decarbonization results in higher utility bills in the short term.
And I work with Quinn, so it's funny. I was typing it and he was saying it.
Good work, Tim.
Any other equity concerns that people want to lift up just before we get started to be mindful of?
I'll add that I think we hear a lot of talk about it and maybe don't see as much putting up, right? Like the lip service for basically.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this concern of equity washing. I think that's increasingly widespread now, that it's easy to talk about what people are doing, or say we've got various committees or boards to deal with it, and you don't always see what the outcomes of that work are. Those are great starting points. So I'm going to share about our framework that we've developed, and by framework, we mean this big, heavy report that's on the left side here. It's on our website at energyequityproject.com. And this has been the work of about 45 co-authors and advisors over the last 15 months to kind of do a big landscape scan, look at all of the potential best practices and metrics around equity in the energy system, document those, see where they're happening, see where we've got data gaps, which are a pretty extensive problem, and put all of that into this package as a form of guidance that people can kind of pick and choose from, depending on where their interests and the priorities of their communities lie. So there's the report there on the left, and then on the right side, this is a screenshot of an interactive map that is in development. So I will give you a demonstration of that. We should be releasing a public beta version within the next couple of weeks once we get a couple of final bugs worked out. But I'll show you the data sets that are loaded there and how you'll be able to navigate that and work with some of that data. So just in terms of things that I wanted to cover, I'll show you what's in that report, so it's a little easier to navigate, given that it is so long. And then talk about some of the steps that we've identified that organizations, but also regulators, policymakers, utilities might take to advance energy equity and to select some metrics for accountability that speak to your concern, Robin. And then we'll get into some of the mapping and data, and I hope have a lot of time for discussion. So the work is based here at University of Michigan. I know some of you at least know Dr. Tony Reams. He's one of the leading scholars on energy justice and now advising the White House on integrating energy justice in all of the Justice 40 work. It's currently being led while Dr. Reams is on leave at DOE by Dr. Kyle White, who's also part of the White House EJ Advisory Council. And we've had this great team of advisors behind the work since its founding in 2018. In terms of the people that actually contributed to the work, we've got, this is that big list of co-authors and people that put in just amazing amounts of time and contributions to pull this together. They represent a range of sectors, mostly in the nonprofit space. Some are directly from impacted communities, some are in government, others are utility contractors. So it's a pretty broad range here. It's a group of majority BIPOC folks, 85% women. All of the lead authors are women. So just a big shout out to their work on this. And we were organized into these 4 different work groups based on the different dimensions of energy equity. So back in 2018, there wasn't nearly as much conversation as there is today around energy equity. And so I think the founding members and advisors recognized that without that, people are just going to kind of go their own way, say, yeah, look, we're doing equity. We had a couple meetings with community, that should count. Or, we've identified areas of high energy burden. What else should we be doing? And so the idea was that we needed both a way to consistently measure energy equity, but also to provide some guidance, given the complexity around it. And so our vision was that doing this work would lead to meaningful benefits for BIPOC, frontline, and low-income communities. And this would really help to reshape, I think, the energy future and make sure that we don't have a repeat of, energy system 1.0, where all of the benefits are flowing to wealthier and whiter communities, and we see communities of color bearing the bulk of the burdens of that energy system. We wanted to make sure that a clean energy system is not replicating those same inequities. So in terms of framework applications, I think this is especially timely now with all of the federal investments that are coming down. We do see it initially as a starting point for communities to strengthen the narratives that they've long been telling us, and those haven't necessarily been taken as seriously as they should have been, particularly in these kind of technocratic, regulatory, energy planning spaces, right, where we've been hearing their stories, but we've heard directly from frontline community organizations that having more data to back those lived experiences would be really valuable. We've got about a dozen states that are working on their own definitions of what an environmental justice community looks like, or a disadvantaged community, the term that's used by Justice 40. And that's often a very data-driven process. We think this should help to serve how we are allocating the benefits of Justice 40. I think when we look at the IRA bill, for instance, we see that that's probably not aligned with hitting the Justice 40 standard of 40% of the benefits going to disadvantaged communities. So we need to do some quantification there, not just let it be a long list of kind of sub-programs that are counted. And then we've got some, more aspirational dreams for this work that, we'll see how these happen, but we just want to put those out there as well. How do we rethink and reshape the entire energy system, and think about the intersection of restorative justice in this space as well. So we got started just recognizing that there's not a standard definition for energy equity. We see a lot of different terms that are put out there: energy justice, energy equity, affordability, security, right? All of these terms can kind of feel like overload. And so we wanted to just get really clear on what we are talking about in this framework. So we're using these what are often called 4 pillars of energy justice that are pretty widely used in this space and in the literature. So recognition is really about who, thinking about which communities we are talking about. And that often intersects with the distributive element here. So we think about where are those burdens and benefits accruing, or to which communities. And these two are often measurable, right? We can come up with metrics around community demographics. We can think about measuring things like energy savings or workforce development benefits on the distributive side. The procedural side, this is really about what voice and what influencing power do communities have, particularly people that have been marginalized and left out of the energy planning and decision-making processes previously. And so these tend to be much more qualitative in nature, best practices that we want to encourage people to follow. And then something that I think is unique about our framework is this focus on restorative justice. And this gets into issues like Indigenous sovereignty, it gets into energy democracy. So thinking about some of these issues that, I think are not common to see in a lot of these, professional or regulatory spaces. How do we elevate those? How do we really draw attention to the seriousness of these injustices that people have long faced, and ensure that those don't happen again with this next round of clean energy investments? So we had a work group with about 10 members for each of these different dimensions. Their first task was to come up with sub-indices. So recognition is about demographics, but it's also about looking at historical impacts and cumulative impacts, for instance. The distributive work group was focused on affordability, on household and community benefits. The procedural work group was looking at both access to programs, but also access to procedural or decision-making spaces. So once they had done some more thinking, just so we had smaller segments of metrics and best practices, they spent a long time thinking about guiding principles and wanting to make sure that these were there as kind of the true north that all stakeholders could turn back to before we were setting metrics. So it's, I think, much easier to just plunge in and say, well, why don't we start measuring these things without understanding why we're doing that or what their potential value is, as opposed to say, if we say, okay, a guiding principle is that we're serving all renters equally in the same way that we are homeowners. What does that mean then for program design and the metrics that we're selecting to consider that? And then each of these different dimensions has a selection of metrics where data makes sense, and then best practices where they're more qualitative in nature. So this is a summary of what the kind of entire framework of these 4 dimensions look like. And I know it's a lot on the page, so a lot of this presentation is about what you can find and explore within the report itself, even though you won't be able to read everything here in the slides. But it's those 4 dimensions on the left, the indices that represent them, some basic description of each of those indices and a sampling of the metrics and best practices that apply. So I'll run through some snapshots from the framework, resources that are there and available for people to check out. So here's an example of guiding principles that were developed by the distributional work group. So there's a lot of concern around affordability and energy burdens, right? And I think this would inform, for instance, how we think about electrification and what impacts it has on affordability if we are committed to saying nobody faces an energy burden above 10%, and that we want to make sure we have a pathway that everybody gets below 6% in some reasonable time frame, say in the next few years. So we've got principles for each of the 4 dimensions. Then we've got a sampling of best practices. And for these, we drew on existing literature, other toolkits and frameworks, what we heard from about 400 participants in 10 listening sessions in summer 2021. And ultimately, we heard 148 proposed best practices or metrics that we cataloged, reviewed, gave guidance on whether we thought this was useful or not. So those are all summarized in pretty good depth and guidance on how you might go about adopting these. A lot of the metrics that we've included are what was available at the census tract level nationally. So we miss a lot of local data, particularly around health. And many of these then rely on census tract US Census variables with demographics, but some I think are interesting data sets to bring in, ones that are not typically looked at. For instance, this eviction risk, which is based on eviction filings by county that's provided by the Eviction Lab. The restorative chapter is one of my favorites here. Here's a snapshot of their work around Indigenous sovereignty. I think it does a really nice job getting pretty deep into some of these concepts and talking about why these are especially pertinent for the energy system. So that's what you'll find in each of the chapters. And then the opening chapter is really more about the steps to advancing energy equity. And so we've got these 7 steps. They don't all need to happen sequentially. They don't all need to take the same amount of time. But I think it's really important, again, to note that the first 4 steps here, before we start to talk about data or equity targets, right? This is all process-based. This is about making sure we have people at the table, that participation is representative, that we have a shared language around energy equity and what we're talking about. And this all happens right before we say, okay, these are the metrics that we think we need in order to ensure accountability. And then these are the best practices that we should adopt because we don't believe that data is the best way to go in order to achieve equity. So we detail equity considerations for different audiences and align these with each of those 4 equity dimensions. And then we do get into some guidance around, we've got this overwhelming number of potential measures and best practices, and what's the best way once you do get to this step to think about selecting these. And so we have this 2x2 matrix. Ideally, we are as much as possible in this top right quadrant where we've got high quality and highly available data that's updated regularly, that's trustworthy, and that also reflects high impact data, data that's relevant to communities. And so up here on the top right, our suggestion is that we've got some metrics or best practices for each of the 4 dimensions. So there's a balanced portfolio. We think about this the same way we do wheels on a vehicle, right? A 3-wheeled vehicle is not going very far. And we would say the same about an approach to equity that emphasizes 2 or 3 of the dimensions and leaves another one behind. And then we have some different levels, kind of degrees of difficulty, if you will, down here on the bottom right. So some of these we're calling core metrics or basic. There's an intermediate level of suggestions, and then some more advanced that may have additional value, but they may take extra work in order to get access to that data. So here is the full kind of summary of our catalog, or what we're calling an atlas of these 148 energy equity measures. You'll see that we excluded about half of these on the right 2 columns, either because they weren't requested or deemed sufficiently valuable or unique by the work groups, or because we thought there were kind of long-term issues with the data where we wouldn't be able to get a reliable source to it. We've got 27 that were shifted to best practices here, and that applies to all of the dimensions. A number of the procedural metrics, people wanted to create rating scales. So this might be around, for instance, the quality of equity initiatives internally practiced by public utility commissions. So asking stakeholders to score that on something like a 1 to 5 scale. We do have a number of priority data gaps. The most profound and pressing one we hear is about shutoff data. That's consistently raised by activists as something that's lacking and would be a game changer if we could get that data nationally. And then we do have 29 that are included. I think there are just 26 on the map at this point, and there are a couple of data updates there as well. So that's the full set. Each of these are cataloged in detail. So on the right, you'll see each metric listed, its dimension that it aligns with, the subdimension, the geographic resolution. There may be information about how frequently it's updated, and then the scores that the working groups provided, which I think is really valuable. So generally, we used 4 out of 5 as the cutoff for whether something was included. Transparency is a big part of why this report is so unduly long, because we wanted people to know how these decisions were made, who showed up to each of the listening sessions that we had, how they were rating things during live polling. So we have a lot of this information where we've tried to be, a really open book about the conversations that we were having internally, if there were tensions between different groups and how we were weighing those. And then on the right side, we've got an image just of the notes taken by the restorative justice group and how they were kind of wrestling with their own principles and their movement toward guiding principles. And then the last piece, because it is so long, one of our priority tasks for the upcoming months is making this more accessible in a way that's inviting and friendly to different communities, that's available in multiple languages, really starting to get to some of these bite-sized pieces so that people can dig in and use elements of that. So that's what we've got in the report. And I think, I think about this just like I think about anti-racism work, that certainly we all, as individuals and organizations, have our own history of the work, right? But it's really each moment where we have this choice to make of either we are actively doing something to advance energy equity, or by default, if we are not choosing to do that, then we are just enabling the default, which is an inequitable energy system in most locations. But we do have that opportunity. So whether somebody has been a good partner or not in this work, that can shift in a moment. And so that's a note of hope. All right, I'm gonna leave off, unless Raul has joined us. Doesn't look like it. Okay. Some of the details about how we've gone through this data. This is really more Raul's specialty, but I will flip
Justin,
through.
I'm
right
here. I don't know why I'm appearing with your name as well, but I am on the call.
Oh, super. Well, welcome, Raul, who has just been a tremendous lead for all of our data science work here throughout the process. So he is, just tremendous in helping us get all of this together and accessing the data. So Raul, I'll click through if you want to present here.
Definitely. So what we aim to do here is really kind of just present how we went from the concept of bringing about all of this data to being able to provide more of what we call like a data narrative with a lot of visuals and analysis so that the everyday user can be able to understand and really kind of go from goal setting all the way to understanding and how you can meet those goals from an equity standpoint. So for us, it starts with data retrieval. Then we go through a very hefty data cleaning process and unification process. We do a bunch of data processing in order to provide context into what the data is talking about. And then lastly, we go into analysis and visualization. If we could go towards the next slide there. So data retrieval. So this happened through a lot of different ways. So unfortunately, there isn't one centralized kind of data hub in the United States where you can get all of the information you'd want about the energy system. You can see a couple of our sources on the right-hand side over there, again, highlighting all the different places where we would be getting all of these variables. And on the left-hand side, how we kind of got from them. And I really want to kind of highlight the diversity and kind of the effort that it took. Justin really put like a lot of work, especially into contacting different organizations directly and making requests for data. So that would be like over email, talking to people, working on how they could share the data with us. Some of it went into actually going into their organizational sites and just trying to find the correct Excel files or CSVs. And then other organizations like the US Census Bureau thankfully had kind of this automatic data reporting method already built in, which is, if you're familiar, API requests. So essentially we're able to be able to send their kind of servers and database a request for their information, and they respond to us in real time. And that was great, but just kind of showing you the diversity to be able to just get the data that we're looking for. And again, this is from a very short range of variables. We weren't able to get data on everything just because a lot of the variables data didn't exist for. Let's go on to the next slide there. Next, we go into a data cleaning method, and more than anything, we wanted to be able to associate each specific piece of data with a specific census tract. So all these census tracts have different IDs. Unfortunately, not all of them across all these data sources because they're not done all by the same organizations. They're not always properly formatted. They're not always properly matched across different data sources. So we had to go through a lot of this kind of cleaning process, making sure the naming structures were the same throughout. Understanding where the gaps were. So even if these organizations theoretically collected data on these areas or for different locations around these specific variables, a lot of missing values were kind of coded in. And so we really had to differentiate between when was there actually data and when there wasn't, even if they said there was. And then lastly, we just wanted to make sure everything was coded up correctly. So everything that's supposed to be a number is a number. If it's in thousands of people or if it's in thousands of dollars, we understand what the units are, et cetera. So that comes from a more data maintenance standpoint. Then we went on to data processing. So the biggest piece of processing here was some variables only exist at a state or county level. So if you provide a statewide score or average or a county level score or average, how do you translate that to the level of analysis we wanted to provide? Because we chose census tracts as our kind of unit of analysis, what we do is we broadcast these scores. So let's say a state had a specific energy equity score of, let's say, 5. We would say all census tracts within this state now have 5. We unfortunately, that's the best we could do with the data that was available to us in order to understand what the differences were and be able to at least provide some level of analysis there. Because census tracts are extremely different, even if they're neighbors to one another, we transform these into percentages, just because this allowed for a much better and clearer comparison than just presenting, for example, raw scores or raw numbers in terms of median income or vulnerability, or climate vulnerability or social vulnerability. And lastly, in order to visualize a lot of this, what we did initially for our maps was we filtered out the data for states and territories that do not exist within the contiguous United States. It's not that we didn't have data for these, it's just for this initial kind of version 1 level of analysis, we wanted to fit this all on a map that would be easily readable. Lastly, we went into visualizing these examples in a form of analysis. So I'll go through a couple of examples of how we did this. So one way you can look at this is just from a grand landscape across the United States here. You can see we're trying to visualize energy burden, but we're also trying to visualize at the same time for census tracts that are majority BIPOC census tracts or majority white census tracts. So majority BIPOC are going to be in this bluish hue across the United States, and majority white census tracts are going to be in this kind of orangish hue. However, the shading is proportional to the level of energy burden. And so if you start from this kind of level of analysis, you can really start identifying what are going to be the communities that are going to be at most need. Or depending on the vernacular you're using, are going to be the most disadvantaged or the most vulnerable. And you can start kind of seeing these like hot spots around here. So for example, you see this really dark blue in California on the left-hand side. And there's another one a little bit towards the middle of the United States. If you were to then say, I want to zoom into these locations and kind of get a better understanding, this is how you would kind of start building out a narrative. So take it from a national or semi-national level, filter it down to, for example, this case in California on the left-hand side. If we could just go to the next slide here. Oh, sorry. Another way to visualize this data is, so first we saw it geographically. Another way to visualize this is, for example, just in a simple graph. Here we're able to show very clearly that energy burden disproportionately affects people of color or majority people of color census tracts than majority white census tracts, especially as you move from less than 3% energy burden to more than 15%, you see that kind of very clear trend. The decreases in the blue and then just increases in the orange over there. If we go to that next slide, so like I said, we're going from a semi-national understanding to a more state level understanding. Here we're just looking at energy burden, and we're able to kind of just see here. What we also did is we looked at heat vulnerability. So we filtered out all census tracts that were, we filtered out all census tracts that were 75% of not heat vulnerable. And so this is basically the top 25 census tracts in California that are the most vulnerable to heat waves. Within these, we visualized energy burden. So now we're looking at kind of this combination of these are the census tracts that are at most risk towards heat wave. Where are they going to be most energy vulnerable as well? And we kind of can see, we can narrow this down to this county on the bottom right-hand side over here that's highlighted in this red, where you can see where most of the darker shading exists. And we're able to zoom down even further and say, okay, now we know that this county is at risk of heat, is really heavily at risk of heat waves, has really high energy burden. Now let's look at its seniors living alone. So really kind of trying to better understand this kind of narrative of, okay, within this county, you kind of can see the right-hand side of this county is going to be at most risk of seniors living alone. The left-hand side, not so much. And we can kind of do this in a couple of different ways and with a couple of different variables. But this kind of shows the narrative we want to focus on of going from this really semi-national perspective, trying to get an understanding what's going on in these different areas and narrowing down to a more local or community level analysis and being able to play around with a couple of different variables there. Yep, and
Yeah.
thank you so much, Justin.
Thanks, Raul. That was really great to have you jump in and present there. I'm going to pull up the map, but I think this would be a good spot for questions as well.
Great. Everybody in the room, we've got about 30 people. We've got 1 or 2 coming and going, but we've grown since we first started. So please feel free to come off chat even, or raise your hand or enter them into the chat that's available in our Zoom. Justin, you said that you're bringing up the map. Is that to kind of show some examples? Is that what we're headed? Is that the idea? Okay, great.
Yeah.
I think as you're doing that, I'm just kind of wowed by, this is a national framework and you have some local drill down in it. I'm curious for the folks in our virtual room, who has already used the Energy Equity Project report in some way, or the mapping feature itself? Maybe use the Zoom hand raise feature if you have. I'm not seeing any hands, so either people are having an afternoon snack or this is really new to everyone here.
Yeah, and we're really interested in how people think they might be able to use this, and which points are worthwhile, what you're looking for that you may not have seen yet that we can think about as improvements to both the report and the guidance, but also the data elements as well, to make that most useful.
Yeah, I can just say that I'm really excited about this work. I'm Sydney Applegate from the Department of Energy Building Technologies Office. And I'm aware of Justin and his work at the Energy Equity Project. And we'll be building off of some of this work with project with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab this year. So I'm very excited to see that this is coming out so that can help inform our project there.
Super, thanks, Sydney. All right, so here's the map, and I think the visualizations that Raul showed were ones that he did in a different space. So same data that's underlying it, and I think that's one of the great things, that this is all open source. Raul, maybe you can just post the GitHub link if people are interested in downloading the data with all of the census tracts and each of the variables there. But so here's the map, and this is a list of all of the variables or the data sets that are loaded. And so let's do this collectively. So I'll go through this slowly, so you can see what's here. So percent BIPOC, we will break this out individually by race before long. That's high on our priority list. Community power scores about legislation, especially that enables solar and energy democracy elements. Energy burden, people are familiar with. Energy efficiency savings as a percentage of the total energy efficiency revenue, I believe. So this is ACEEE data for large investor-owned utilities primarily. We have equity in residential rates, so looking at the percentage that residents are charged compared to commercial and industrial customers. We have a number of the climate risk data sets, so heat waves, hurricane risk, and wildfires. Home energy affordability gap is another affordability measure. And this looks at the amount of dollars that it would take for the average person, the average low-income household, to achieve a 6% energy burden. So we're looking at households below 200% of federal poverty level, and how much in dollars it would take to get them to an affordable bill. We have age of housing, educational attainment, internet access, mobile homes, A lot of demographics here. Median income of households with solar is kind of interesting. You can see all of the blank spots where we don't have at least 10 households installing solar in that tract in order to be able to report this. So it's concentrated where solar is popular. And then we've got, yeah, that's about the end of the list. So what we can do here, for instance, is look at two of those variables like Raul showed. So if we take a look at, tracts where we've got majority BIPOC, for instance, we can do that, and then we can add another filter. So this could be hurricane risk, for instance, and we can start to look at some of the tracts, right, where this is a bigger issue or where we've got higher hurricane risk. And the other cool thing about this data is once we are identifying these, you can see how kind of pixelated a lot of these are, which is one of the bugs that we're trying to work through. But you can click an individual tract here, and then you get the full readout of their data on the right. So I think that's a really cool thing that communities will be able to do this. I think we're thinking about some other like lookup features. So if you wanted to look up a county, we would know which census tracts that included and could give you that data as well. But yeah, you can see all of that here and what that looks like. So basically being able to identify communities that meet two of these criteria that are user defined with these filters, and then getting the full report for a particular community. That's the idea behind the map. And we do just want to wait until we get a couple of these bugs ironed out, but we will be sharing this in the next couple of weeks. And actually, if you happen to be looking at the address here, I'll just share it so people can poke around, but know that it's still in development. But I'll drop the link here.
Thanks so much, Justin. I know you've said that you're really interested in hearing from folks today how they could use it, right? How you might imagine it. I might try to prompt that discussion a little bit if that's to head it in that direction. We're hearing we have so much federal funding in front of us from the Infrastructure Act and from the Inflation Reduction Act, and with Justice 40 commitments, we know that the screening tool and the scorecard have been put forth from the White House in as aids, right, to help do the identification and figure out when we are honoring the commitments by plowing the benefits into the community where they're intended to be plowed. How do you imagine this map and this tool working to benefit communities, policymakers, frontline folks toward securing those federal funds where they're supposed to go?
Yeah, I think certainly we would want a lot of feedback from communities on how to use this. So I don't want to tell anybody, these are kind of the priority criteria that you should be looking at, but I think we can make these options available to people. So when we're talking about climate resilience funding, right, we know we have certain data sets where we can say these, I think, can help identify communities with particular vulnerabilities, right? Whether that's seniors living alone, people in mobile homes, renters, people without internet access, people who don't speak English well. And so we can think about how do we identify the communities that face these specific vulnerabilities and probably need a different approach to communication, to education, but also, right, I think where a lot of the benefits kind of get amplified. So if we think about electrification for a household that's relatively energy secure, housing secure, right, they're going to see some financial benefit, and that's mainly the extent of it, as opposed to somebody who maybe if their power goes out, right, they have a long-term medical condition that requires constant power, and then all of a sudden this is a threat to life, or on the positive side, this is a long-term benefit that can be life-saving if people have resilient power. So I think those sorts of ways of identifying, it's been used in more of a punitive sense, I think, like the term disadvantaged communities, for instance, right, which is not what environmental justice communities have put forth. That's kind of been pushed on top by government agencies. But if we think about this as kind of flipping that narrative of where are the benefits most useful, and identifying communities using data for that, that's where I think this can be really valuable. And then we have a number of data gaps, which you don't see here, but in tribal lands in particular, there's a lot of missing data. And I think those are cases where we say, we just inherently need to make sure that they're getting a greater share of the benefits, because in some cases, right, like invisibility is a long-term issue with tribal communities. And this is like a very literal example when they don't show up on the map or they have missing data. And so that's a strong argument, I think, for them to kind of get elevated in that priority for the federal funds.
Great. Just another nudge to share your questions. Feel free to come off mute, raise your hand, come off mute, or drop it in the chat. In the meantime, your remarks there, Justin, just made me question. I don't remember or didn't notice whether outage data are in the tool or not, whether power outages are in there.
Yeah, we do not have outage data. Raul, I don't know if you want to speak to our efforts to get this at the census tract level and what we were running into.
Yeah, in terms of like outage data and reliability data in that sense, the data is just honestly not there. What you can get from, for example, EIA is they would be able to give you the average outage data across their whole service territory. So for example, in Michigan, one of the utilities is DTE, and it would tell you, for example, the number of minutes across all of its customers, across all DTE customers where like an outage occurred. So for example, you would see like an extremely small number, even seconds at points, and it's not really realistic, right? Because A, it doesn't tell you where the outages occurred, and B, it's not reflective of the true time, because there could be communities that have, for example, days worth of outages and communities where there are no outages at all, and that just gets kind of spread out across thousands and thousands of homes. So while it's theoretic, or while it is, I guess, reported, it's not reported at any level that's useful for community engagement or analysis.
Right. I didn't ask that follow-up question with this one in mind, but it's surfacing because I think at the front of Justin's presentation, I think you really focused on metrics, right? Which I think most of us probably hear that word in a very quantitative way. We're imagining a data set, talking in percentages and numbers, maybe absolute numbers, and then best practices, right? You notice that even in some of the original metrics categories, some of those were moved into a best practice framing for the work or for the report. I'm curious if you noticed anything in the process of doing this work, any tension, any aha moments related to our acceptance of understanding conditions in a place or with people that aren't quantified. I'm coming from a place of observing, probably bringing some of my experience that there's this favor, especially in energy space, this favoritism for the quantitative, and there are other stories, there are other experiences that you just can't force into a percentage sometimes. What surfaced?
Yeah, a couple of things, and I love the question. The first is that, I think if we were really doing things equitably, which means thinking about equity in all of our decisions, it was part of everybody's job description, these sorts of things, right? Then I don't think we would need metrics. So we could have utilities, for instance, say they're going to just stop shutting people off from power, and then we don't need to come up with all of these rules about how we require data disclosures and what that looks like. And so I think metrics in the quantitative sense are really kind of the backstop for when we're not doing things right. So we're kind of compelling people to be incrementally better actors, but it's not this deep vision of equity that we really have there. So I think anytime we're turning to metrics, we should recognize that that's because there's an issue in the system that we are needing data, right? Or because we need to be able to operate in these spaces that require quantitative evidence in order to, for instance, come before a PUC and demand something. So that's one thing that comes to mind. The next with best practices is, I think a lot of us in these spaces have learned about the differences between outputs and outcomes, or what may be necessary but not sufficient. And the same absolutely holds with energy equity, right? So if we're talking about, we often hear marketing materials should be culturally appropriate, available in multiple languages and formats, which is absolutely true. But if that doesn't change who's participating, then it doesn't really matter, right? How good or how kind of aligned with those best practices this is. And so I think in some cases we need to do both. We need to improve our practices, but we also need to see if those are actually changing the outcomes. And so there can be some synergy there between qualitative efforts and whether we're able to measure those as longer term outcomes.
Great answer. Are there any other questions? Are folks overwhelmed? There's a lot in this report, right? And a lot to imagine about what you can mine from the map. No, it's a safe space. And you can ask questions.
Just on that note, I want to offer, so we'll be organizing a few different communities of practice to help take on, a section or a topic of the report at a time, and just to have more open conversation where people can come with their issues and see ways that we can apply the framework. So we're looking to putting out a call within a few weeks and just explaining how we'll be available to help people implement and start to adopt pieces of the framework.
Are you imagining those communities of practice almost being like a train the trainer? So
I think more so on like how do we implement in our own communities, in our own spaces, but they will be tailored to different audiences. So we'll have one, I think, for regulators specifically because they've got such specific needs, another for frontline communities, and then probably a third for nonprofits and other government folks.
Mm-hmm.
See, Liz,
yeah, we've got I didn't see which happened first, the hand or the comment. And so I'm going to ask Lynn to go ahead and come off mute. And then after that, it's a long one. So then after that, I'm going to read the question in the chat.
Yes, hi, I'm Liz Hackton and I volunteer with 350 Wisconsin. We've been looking at energy equity in our in South Central Wisconsin and want to broaden that across the state. And we've been primarily using the LEAD tool. So I'm so appreciative of the additional data that is being pulled in here and just in awe of Justin and Raul. So thank you so much. So I want to, because I'm going to ask some questions that might sound less appreciative. And, but yeah. So first of all, will there be a way to combine census tracts into be able to look at a city or town or county level? That's one question I have. And then another question really goes way beyond what you've done, which is, what would you say to folks who are trying to drill down below the census tract level? So for example, in Madison, where we have looked extensively, as I said, using the LEAD tool, what we're finding is that we have pockets of lower income, highly energy burden folks living in all of our census tracts. So the And it's only about maybe 10% or less of the city population. So the fact that these pockets are spread out across the city means that the census tracts look very, the census tract level data is very favorable. And we can't, it's hard to drill down to know like where to look at, what neighborhoods or, this, as I said, the subs census tract level, what's our next step? So again, that second question is way beyond your tool, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I appreciate it. Raul, do you want to speak to the combining geographies, and I can speak to the second half?
Definitely. So while that functionality doesn't currently exist within the tool that we're releasing, what I can say is that within the data, there's actually a way to do that yourself or have someone do that, in that the way each census tract is identified is through what we call like a census tract ID. And what's really nice about how these things are built is that they're kind of like it's a state number plus a county number plus a census number. So if you were looking for example, all census tracts for a specific county, that's going to be the first, for example, 6 digits. And the nice way about how we organized our data is that we associated it directly with the U.S. Census Bureau. So if you go to the U.S. Census Bureau and you Google, for example, address to county number or address to census tract ID, you can even put in your address and it'll give you your census tract ID. And it'll tell you like, this is the state number, this is the county number, this is the census number. And so then you can kind of look for all of the census tracts that fit within a single county that you're looking for a given address. Or you could even look at your census tract given your own address as well. So while the functionality isn't necessarily, I guess, like readily available, you'd still be able to do that if you played around with the data in the link that we provided in the chat. I hope I didn't get too technical there, but essentially, if you can find your county number, you can definitely group together a bunch of census tracts.
Great, thank you. That is clear.
Yeah, and then at the household or block level, we can get a little bit more of that data for some of the demographics. I think we're always going to have this gap, though, and I think it's a really important point that there are households, right, that get absorbed or masked by being aggregated into these larger geographies, even at the size of the census tract. And so I think that means, we always need good outreach and good relationships with people so that we're not missing out on household benefits, right, that we see provisions for in IRA, for instance, and making sure that even if we're in a census tract that's predominantly one demographic, we're not missing households that are there that don't fit with that, or right, the median doesn't capture them. So I think, it just speaks to what we can lose, I think, in aggregating and the importance of individual level efforts.
Great. I just wanted to note that, Justin, you're being video bombed by a feline, and
Funny. That reminds me of that good old one from a couple of years ago with the judge.
And there was an update I entered an update in the chat that we are aiming to close at 2:30 instead of 2:45.